People tell you the greatest joy in life is hearing your child call you dad. I believe that with every fiber of my being. For years, I worked my fingers to the bone, carried burdens no one saw, and gave up my dreams just to give my son a future. At least, I thought he was my son. Because one night, a single truth shattered everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my family. My wife lied about the one thing a man should never have to question. And when the truth finally came out, I didn't just leave her. I gave her a truth so devastating she could never escape it. I was 58 years old when my life began to unravel, though the seeds of it had been planted decades earlier. On the outside, I looked like any other man in my neighborhood. I had a house with peeling white paint, a truck that rattled when it hit the wrong bump, and a reputation for being the guy you could call if your fence fell down or your lawnmower broke. People saw me as steady, reliable, maybe a little boring, but dependable. That's who I'd always been. Dependable. I learned it from my father, who worked his back into the dirt in a steel mill until the day his body gave out. He used to tell me, a man's word and his work are all he's got. I carried that into every corner of my life. It was the reason I never walked away from responsibility, even when it crushed me. When I met Linda, I thought I'd finally been rewarded for all that sacrifice. She was younger than me by nearly a decade, and back then she lit up every room she entered. She had that spark, the kind that made you feel lucky just to be noticed. I was 40, set in my ways, rough around the edges, but somehow she chose me. At least that's what I thought. Our wedding wasn't extravagant, but I remember feeling like I'd won the lottery. She wore a simple dress, nothing like the gowns you see on TV, but I couldn't stop staring at her. Friends patted me on the back, told me I'd done well for myself, and I believed them. I believed I'd built a life with a woman who valued the same things I did: honesty, loyalty, and family. When Michael was born 2 years later, I thought the picture was complete. I held him in the hospital, my rough hands shaking as I cradled this tiny, fragile life. My father had died by then, and I remember whispering into that newborn's ear, "Don't worry, son. I'll do what Grandpa did for me. I'll never let you down." That promise became my compass. Every day, every decision, I measured against it. I worked long shifts at the manufacturing plant, sometimes 14 hours, sometimes through weekends. My knees ached, my back screamed, but every time I thought about quitting, I pictured Michael's face. I wanted him to have what I didn't: a safe home, opportunities, a chance to dream. Linda didn't work much after he was born. At first I didn't mind. I told myself she deserved the break, that raising a child was work too. I tightened the belt, picked up overtime, let my body take the punishment. I told myself love meant sacrifice, but sacrifice has a way of turning one-sided when it's not appreciated. The first time Linda cut me down, it was over something small. I'd come home covered in grease after working on the truck, and she wrinkled her nose. "You smell like an old man," she said, laughing. Michael doesn't need a dad who comes home reeking of sweat and oil. It stung, but I brushed it off. People joke, couples tease. That's what I told myself. Then the comments kept coming. When I preferred staying home to save money instead of going out, she'd roll her eyes. "You're no fun." Sometimes I wonder if I married a paycheck instead of a person. When my knees started acting up and I winced climbing the stairs, she smirked. "You're falling apart already. What am I supposed to do with an old man who can barely walk?" At first I laughed with her, pretended it didn't cut. But when the jokes keep coming, they stop sounding like jokes. They start sounding like the truth someone's been hiding. I began to notice other things. The way she'd light up when talking to other men at gatherings, while her eyes dulled when she looked at me. The way she'd spend hours on her phone, smiling at messages she never shared. The way she'd tell friends, "Michael's the only reason I haven't lost my mind with him." That line, "Michael's the only reason," echoed in my head like a curse. Still, I held on. For my son, I thought if I just kept working, kept providing, kept enduring, everything would be fine. But as Michael grew older, little doubts started worming their way in. He was a good kid, bright, curious, full of energy. But people would sometimes comment, "He doesn't really look like you, does he?" They'd say it innocently with a smile, but every time I heard it, a stone settled heavier in my stomach. His eyes were a shade I didn't recognize. His smile crooked in a way mine never was. He had habits, quirks, ways of moving that didn't feel like mine. Parents are supposed to see themselves in their children, some reflection, some continuation. But when I looked at Michael, I couldn't find myself. I hated myself for thinking that way. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was paranoid. That love mattered more than blood, that I was being insecure, weak. But then came the moment that changed everything. Michael was 10 when he got sick at school. Nothing serious, just a stomach bug, but they rushed him to the ER to be safe. Linda was frazzled, pacing the waiting room while I filled out paperwork. A nurse asked for medical history, the usual routine. I rattled off mine, listing the conditions that ran in my family. Heart issues, diabetes, a few genetic things. She frowned at the chart, then at me. "Are you sure you're his father?" she asked lightly, like it was nothing. "Some of these don't match up at all." Her tone was casual, but the words hit me like a hammer to the chest. I laughed it off, pretending I hadn't heard, but inside something cracked wide open. I looked at Linda. Her face went pale. She waved it off quickly, too quickly, saying, "Oh, you know how family histories can be confused. Don't worry about it." But I saw the flicker in her eyes. That flicker of panic. That was the moment the suspicion turned into certainty. The moment the walls of my world began to crumble. And as I drove us home from the hospital that night, Michael asleep in the back seat, Linda staring silently out the window, I knew one thing for certain. I needed the truth. Even if it destroyed me, that drive home from the hospital was the longest of my life. The hum of the tires on the pavement, the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers, it all seemed louder than the silence sitting between us. Linda stared out the passenger side window, her reflection caught in the dark glass, her lips pressed tight together. I didn't say a word, but inside my head there was a storm raging. Every glance in the rearview mirror at Michael's sleeping face made my stomach twist tighter. The nurse's question replayed in my mind like a broken record. "Are you sure you're his father?" Innocent words, casual tone, but I couldn't unhear them. That night I lay awake in bed beside Linda, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above us. Her breathing was steady, but I could tell she wasn't asleep either. Every shift of her body, every sigh, every twitch felt like a signal. I wanted to turn to her, to ask her outright, to demand the truth, but I didn't. I was afraid of the answer. The days that followed were torture. Every little thing became evidence in my mind. The way Michael's hair curled differently than mine ever had. The way Linda seemed on edge whenever family resemblance came up in conversation. Even the way she avoided my eyes when I mentioned the hospital visit. Finally, one evening, I couldn't take it anymore. Michael was at a friend's house for a sleepover, and it was just the two of us in the kitchen. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and asked, "Linda, why did you look so nervous at the hospital?" She froze, spoon in her hand hovering over the pot of soup she was stirring. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I mean," I pressed. When the nurse asked about Michael's history, "You looked like a deer in headlights. Why?" Her laugh was too quick, too forced. "You're imagining things. You're paranoid." That word, paranoid, ignited something in me. For years she'd belittled me, cut me down, made me feel small. But now, with this suspicion eating at me, I couldn't let it go. "I'm not paranoid," I said, my voice low and steady. "I want the truth." Her eyes flicked to mine, sharp and cold. "You're tired, that's all. You've been working too hard. Don't make problems where there aren't any." I dropped it then, but inside I knew I couldn't keep living with the doubt. That weekend, I did something I never thought I'd do. While Linda was out shopping, I dug through her drawer in the bedroom. My hands shook as I opened her old journals, sifted through papers, looking for anything that might give me answers. Guilt clawed at me, but desperation won out, and then I found it. A stack of photos yellowed with age tucked in an envelope. In them, Linda was younger, smiling beside a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark hair, strong jaw. Michael's jaw. My chest tightened as I flipped through picture after picture. That was when I knew. Still, I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. So I went online, my hands trembling as I ordered a DNA test kit. A few swabs of saliva. That was all it would take to either confirm my worst fears or give me the peace I was begging for. When the kit arrived, I told Michael it was just a fun science project. He thought it was cool, and I hated myself for lying to him. I sent it off in the mail, each day that followed, dragging like a year. 2 weeks later, the results came. I sat at the kitchen table, the envelope in my hands, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't want to open it. I wanted to throw it in the trash, pretend none of this was happening. But I had to know. I tore it open, my eyes scanning the page, searching for the words I dreaded. And there it was. Probability of paternity. 0%. I sat there, numb, the paper trembling in my hands. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. 19 years of my life, of working, bleeding, sacrificing, suddenly reduced to a cruel joke. I wasn't his father. The walls seemed to close in on me. My chest heaved, my vision blurred, rage boiling up until I thought I might explode. I slammed my fist on the table so hard the glass shook. "God damn it!" I roared into the empty kitchen, my voice breaking. Linda came in, startled. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I held up the paper, my hand shaking. "You lied to me." "You lied to me about everything." Her face went white, then flushed red with anger. "You went behind my back? You tested him? Don't you dare turn this on me," I shouted, standing so fast my chair toppled over. "I gave you everything. My life, my years, my body breaking down at work so you could have a roof, so he could have a future. And the whole damn time, he wasn't even mine." Her lip curled, venom in her eyes. "You think you were some great prize? You were just a paycheck. You always were. You think Michael would have had anything if I relied on you alone? You're pathetic. Always have been." Her words cut deeper than the DNA test ever could. I stood there, shaking, my fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. For a moment I wanted to hit something, break something, scream until the walls fell down. But then, a colder feeling settled over me. I realized something in that moment. She thought she'd destroyed me. But what she didn't understand was that she had just freed me, because now I had nothing left to lose. The days after the truth came out were like walking through the ashes of a fire. Everything that had once seemed solid, my marriage, my family, my very identity, was burned down to rubble. Linda avoided me, slinking around the house with that icy glare as if I were the one who betrayed her. Michael, oblivious, went about his life, school, friends, laughing in the living room. And every time I heard his laugh, I felt the knife twist deeper in my chest. But the more I thought about it, the more something hardened inside me. I'd given Linda 20 years of my life. 20 years of blood and sweat, thinking I was building a family, when in reality I was just her puppet. She'd strung me along, drained me dry, and laughed behind my back. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. No. If she thought she could lie to me and walk away with everything, she was about to learn what it meant to face a man with nothing left to lose. I started with silence. I stopped reacting to her little jabs, her cruel comments. Instead, I'd sit at the table sipping my coffee, staring at her long enough to make her squirm. I could see the unease building in her eyes. She was used to me snapping, to me playing the fool. But when I grew quiet, calculating, she didn't know what to do. Next, I began gathering evidence. I pulled our financial records, tracing money transfers, hidden accounts. I knew Linda was greedy enough to make mistakes. And sure enough, there it was, thousands tucked away in a secret bank account under her name. She'd been siphoning money for years. I copied everything. Every receipt. Every statement. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to bury her with the truth. Then came the photos. That man from the old envelope. I tracked him down. His name was Carl Benson. He lived 2 towns over, a mechanic with a busted-down shop. When I saw him in person, my stomach flipped. The resemblance to Michael was undeniable. Same jawline, same eyes. I walked into his shop one afternoon, pretending my truck needed work. We made small talk, and I casually mentioned Linda's name. The way his face froze told me everything. "You know her," I said flatly. He shifted uncomfortably. "That was a long time ago." "Not long enough," I said. "Michael is yours, isn't he?" Carl's silence was all the answer I needed. I left without another word, but inside the storm was calm now. The pieces were fitting together. The betrayal wasn't just some abstract suspicion anymore. It had a face, a name, a history. That night I sat across from Linda at the dinner table. She picked at her food, her wine glass in hand, not meeting my eyes. I set down my fork and said, "I know about Carl." Her hand froze mid-air, the wine sloshing in her glass. Slowly, she set it down, her face hardening. "You went digging," she said coldly. "I found the truth," I corrected. I slid a stack of printed papers across the table, the DNA test, the bank statements, everything. "This is who you are. A liar, a thief, a fraud. You've been using me for 2 decades. She smirked, a cruel tilt of her lips. "And what do you think you're going to do about it?" "Leave? Go ahead. You'll end up with nothing. The house is in both our names. The savings are joint." "And Michael? He'll never look at you again once I tell him how pathetic you are." Her words were meant to break me. But instead I smiled, because she didn't know what I had planned. "Funny thing," I said calmly. "People don't like liars. Judges don't like thieves. And kids don't like finding out their mother's been lying to them their entire lives." Her smirk faltered. "You see," I continued, leaning forward, "I don't have to yell. I don't have to hit you. I just have to show the truth. And when I do, Linda, you'll be the one with nothing, not me." For the first time I saw fear flicker in her eyes. Just a flash, but enough to tell me I'd hit the mark. Over the next weeks, I set my plan in motion. Quietly, carefully, I met with a lawyer, laid out the evidence, prepared my case. I made copies of everything, stored them where she couldn't touch them, and then came the hardest part. Michael. One evening I sat him down, my hands trembling. "Son," I began, my voice heavy, "there's something you need to know. Something your mother hasn't told you." He looked at me confused.
"Dad, what's going on?"
The word Dad stabbed me, but I pushed through. I showed him the DNA test, the photos, the truth about Carl. His face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't breathe. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't. This can't be." "I wish it weren't," I said softly. "But you deserve to know. You deserve the truth." Tears welled in his eyes, and for the first time, I saw him look at Linda differently. Not with love, not with trust, but with betrayal. That was when I knew I'd already won. Linda screamed, cried, tried to twist the story, painting me as the villain. But Michael didn't buy it. The damage was done, and as she stood there, shrieking, her lies unraveling around her, I felt a calmness wash over me. She thought she could lie forever. She thought she could take everything and leave me broken. But in the end, the truth was the weapon she couldn't defend against, and I was the one holding it. The morning of the hearing felt unreal, like the quiet before a storm you've watched for months on the horizon. I woke early, made coffee with hands that didn't shake as much as they used to when something important was at stake, and dressed in the suit I'd saved for funerals and important meetings. It fit the way old tools fit calloused hands, familiar, comfortable, the sort of armor a man carves out of his life. I looked in the mirror and did not like what I saw, but I recognized it. The face belonged to someone who had been broken and had decided to put the pieces back in order himself. The courtroom smelled of old wood and paper and people's nerves. Linda arrived with her practiced grace, her face a mask of wounded dignity she'd worn so many times she could snap it on like a hat. But the hat didn't sit right this time. It was too heavy. Her eyes flicked the room, hunting for allies. She found a few, those who had preferred easy stories over hard truths. I saw them shift in their seats, uncomfortable, wondering which way the wind would blow. We weren't there for theatrics. I had no appetite for that. I was there to present a ledger of facts so clear even the most charitable person would have to pause. My lawyer, David, had been a quiet force through all of this. He had the calm of a man who knows procedure and the patience of a craftsman. He stood and walked through the evidence with the kind of method that leaves no gaps. The DNA results, the bank transfers, the photos, the receipts, the notary logs, the vendor statements. Each piece was a small unshowy nail. Together they formed a structure that could not be denied. Linda's lawyer tried the usual dance, objections, claims of invasion of privacy, family matters, the tired trope of painting me as a bitter old man. People wanted to believe a neat narrative. I understood that. But the numbers don't lie. The bank paper showed a steady red line in black and white, withdrawals, transfers, payments to an account she controlled. The notary logs revealed signatures hurriedly notarized at odd hours. The vendor invoices bore her initials, and the courier slips pointed to addresses she had given. The DNA test read the coldest words I had ever seen, 0% probability of paternity. All of it together created the weight of evidence. When David paused, letting the file rest on the table between us, the silence in the courtroom felt audible. It was not the silence of suspense for a TV drama. It was the silence of people who had been confronted with a gap between what they thought they knew and what was true. Neighbors shifted, some looking down in shame, some forward in shock. A woman who used to smile at Linda at the church bazaar had tears gathering in her eyes. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the world tilting toward me again. The turning point. The one that really forced everyone to look at Linda with different eyes, came when David produced a series of text messages she had sent to a recurring number. In them she spelled out plans, timelines for the transfer, worries about whether he'd noticed the withdrawals, and a casual, cruel line. He loves the idea of being a father so much he won't ask. Reading those words aloud in court was like pulling the tab on a wound. The smell of falsehood was everywhere. Linda's face crumpled then, not theatrically, but in the honest way of someone surprised by consequence. She mouthed something to her lawyer. He shook his head minutely. A murmur passed through the room as if the air itself were rearranging around the enormity of what had been constructed. My lawyer didn't gloat. He let the law do its work. Alignment, clarity, the stripping of narrative until only facts remained. When I was finally called to speak, I kept it simple. I did not stand to beg. I did not stand to plead. I stood to say the truth as plainly as I could. I gave my life to that family, I said, my voice steady though the memory of 20 years pressed heavy on it. I worked nights and weekends so our son would have a better chance. I believed in the promise of being a father, and I believed in the woman I married. I trusted. I was wrong. The words were not meant to inflame. They were meant to mark the ledger. People listened because the words were the only ones that could match the evidence in front of them. After that day, the legal machinery did its precise, merciless work. Civil claims were resolved first, restitution to recover some of the diverted funds, the transfer of assets that had been hidden into accounts in her name, and the quiet divisions that happen when a house is no longer the place of a couple but property whose ownership must be clarified. She fought, yes. Lawyers argue, people claw where they can. But the texture of her stories changed. She had been able to stare into people's eyes with ease before. Now the eye contact came with a tremor. At the same time, the social consequences unrolled. People who once laughed at her quips now looked away. Those who had accepted generous invitations and gifts began to examine their consciences. The town is a small ecosystem. Reputation matters because it governs how opportunities flow. She had spent the currency of social trust for years. Once it was examined, once receipts were shown, it evaporated. There was one moment I will never forget. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind of day you don't plan for. The gray sky, the smell of coffee, the ordinary movement of people going about chores. Linda came to the front porch with a small box in her hands. She left it there and walked away without looking back. Inside the box were letters and a single photograph of the three of us when Michael was a toddler. Someone in the neighborhood later told me she had walked to the bus and taken the long way out of town. She left with a suitcase and an ugly little dignity that clung to her like thistle. People asked me if I felt a rush when she left, if I had wanted to dance or shout. I didn't. The feeling was different, an odd, quiet closure that felt more like ash cooling than like fireworks. Years of anger had been a furnace in me, but when the heat subsided, what remained was the plain work of rebuilding. Rebuilding was not glamorous. It was paperwork and calls and meeting with accountants to untangle transactions that had been deliberately blurred. It was signing documents to keep the house in my name where the deed had been properly registered, shoring up the mortgage and ensuring my son's future would not be uprooted. It was sitting late at night and writing letters, not to punish her but to explain to my son what had happened in language a man could understand without being crushed by it. That conversation with Michael was the hardest thing I have ever done. I did not want to weaponize his pain. I wanted to give him the truth without disassembling the life he'd known beyond repair. We sat at the kitchen table under a lamp and I told him simply, "There are things about your past I need you to know. Your mother and I made choices. Some of those choices hurt you, and you deserve to know the truth." He listened with that wary stillness of a young man forced to grow up faster than his years. His anger was a quiet, smoldering thing. Hurt, yes, but also the brittle clarity that comes when someone realizes the scaffolding they leaned on was fraudulent. He didn't spit venom at me. He needed time and space, which I gave him. He needed adult affirmation that, despite everything, he was not a mistake. I told him the truth about my love, and the truth about the DNA, the truth about Linda's choices. I told him I would never stop being someone who showed up, who fixed things, who loved him in the practical, ordinary ways that build a life: meals, rides, advice, the long quiet of presence. In that honesty, we began the slow work of repair. There were days when the pride of the town was hard to reclaim. There were neighbors who avoided me out of shame for misjudging, and there were others who returned with casseroles and an awkward tenderness. Community is clumsy that way. It breaks, and then, if it's generous, it attempts to repair. I let it. I accepted soups and offers to help with the gutters and the kind, small acts that meant people were trying to make up for their blind faith in her charm. Legally, Linda paid a price that is both moral and material. Restitution orders were set, liens placed where funds had been traced, and the courts made it clear that deception had consequences. Criminal charges were discussed and, in some instances, pursued. Prosecutors are cautious about family matters, but when paper charts show intent and victims are clear, the law can be unrelenting. The point wasn't revenge in the way tabloids describe it. It was the state exercising its duty to keep order, to make sure people who abuse trust can't continue to do so without consequence. Publicly, the narrative shifted. Where once memes circulated about how lucky she was or how charming she seemed, people now use their platforms to talk about deceit, about why men deserve respect and honesty from their partners, and about how communities must watch for the quiet manipulations that masquerade as domestic bliss. I found something unexpected in the discourse. Strangers wrote letters and messages that read like small lifeboats. I was fooled too. One woman wrote, "Thank you for standing up." Those small affirmations mattered. They carved out space for other men and women to speak about the quiet humiliations they had endured. There was a moment of poetic irony I won't forget. A local charity, one that had accepted funds and grand hosting help from Linda over the years, reached out and asked if I would speak at an event about honesty and accountability. They wanted someone who had lived the story to help the community learn. I agreed, not out of vanity, but because turning a wound into a lesson has a way of healing it. I stood in a modest hall and told my story in plain language, no edge, no sermon. People listened. Some cried, some nodded. The sense that something useful had come from the wreck felt like salve. As for Linda, she reappeared months later in town, thin-faced, apologetic, but hollow. I saw her once across a grocery aisle, pushing a cart and looking smaller than I remembered. Our eyes met. She looked like she was trying to measure the distance between us and miscalculating. I didn't approach her. I watched for a beat and then walked away. Some reckonings don't need a showdown. They happen in the slow evaporation of a life built on falsehoods. Did you ever want to hurt her? Someone asked me later, when the paperwork had mostly been filed and the house felt like it belonged to me again. Did you want her to suffer? I thought about that a long time before answering. The truth is complicated. Part of me wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done. Not vengeance for the sake of cruelty, but accountability. There's a difference. Accountability seeks to restore balance. Cruelty seeks only to feed a wound. I wanted balance. I wanted the scales to stop tipping in her favor. In the quiet after the storm, I found a rhythm. I mended the fence on Saturdays. I fixed the leaky gutter with patient hands. I made coffee on Sunday mornings and watched the light move across the floor in a way that made me feel like I'd earned it. I taught Michael how to change a tire and how to sand a board. We painted a fence together without speaking much, but the work was a kind of language. It stitched us back together with the practical, everyday things that matter. There were scars. There always are. Trust, once broken, is never the same. I catch myself sometimes, expecting deceit, a tiny tremor of suspicion when a friend calls late or a neighbor smiles too brightly. But those tremors are a small price to pay for the clarity I've reclaimed. I learned to read the difference between the kinds of people who perform kindness and those who practice it. I learned to keep paper trails. I learned to be less naive without becoming bitter. There's a relief in that balance. If revenge is the right word to use for what happened in the end, then call it a quiet, well-measured sort of revenge, one executed in the courtrooms and ledgers and in the patient rebuilding of a life. It wasn't a spectacle. It was methodical and, in the long view, durable. She was not publicly humiliated for the sake of entertainment. She was held to account in ways that mattered, legally, socially, and morally. A year later, the house felt like home in a way it hadn't in a long time. It was quieter, yes, but quieter in a healthy way, the kind of quiet that follows heavy rain. Michael came by more often. He stayed for dinner on Sundays. We rebuilt our small rituals, a burger on the grill, a crooked joke about the old truck that never quite ran right, a shared look over a project that needed 2 pairs of hands. Those ordinary things were everything. People who had once judged me for being too trusting came around. Some apologized with awkward casseroles. Some simply nodded once in the hardware store and said, "Good to see you." That was enough. I had no appetite for grand reconciliation with Linda. Her path was hers to walk. I had my life to tend, small and ordinary and real. In the end, the truth did not feel like a weapon so much as a scalpel. Precise, necessary, and ultimately healing when wielded correctly. She lied about our child. She built a life out of deception. I gave her a truth she couldn't handle. Yes, but I did it to protect what mattered most. The man my son was becoming, the home I had built with my hands, and the dignity I refused to let be bartered away. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the clock ticks loud in the kitchen, I think of the man I used to be, so eager to please, so willing to trust without checking. I don't regret the tenderness that made me that man. It's part of what I am. But I do give thanks for the tempering that came after. I am older and harder in the ways I must be, but softer in the ways that count. I can hold my son, laugh with him, and mean it without the old fear gnawing at my bones. She lied. I found out. I did what I had to do, and in doing so, I kept the life that mattered. The victory was not the ruin of another person for sport. It was the reclamation of a life and the protection of a son who deserved the truth. That, in the quiet of the house I still call mine, is enough.